And there were no witnesses. They used him. They said they used him. They used his statement. Isn't that crazy? Yeah. Atkinson's case, they didn't need any witnesses because they had an escape charge and his own statement. So they got up there and they said, they just got up there and they said, his own actions, his own words. He had an escape charge. He escaped from the witness. Yeah. Right? There's no witness. No statement. Right now. Did they tell you? What you said? So what now? Yeah. It's like, okay, we get it. Huh? Oh yeah. I'm gonna start with right? Yeah. I'm gonna put it right up. You get right? That's an opportunity. All right, thanks for the link. Just like How are you doing? Nice to meet you. How you I know your sister. New Haven. Oh, he's New Haven. And she's running the fair right now. And my mom on it.
Oh, fantastic. So your mom's commissioner. That's an important role for securing support for the families of these individuals. I didn't realize that as commissioners and members themselves, they can reduce the rent from 1 to 3. Pretty impressive. There's 12 states, but unfortunately, many of them don't have funding, so they have no power.
That was the law passed. Saying they have to make it. They should have to. Everyone. They should.
Talk a little bit about their oh yeah, that's what I was saying.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Teresa Roxburgh. I'm the director here at the Roxbury Public Library. Thank you all so much for being here today. This is a very exciting occasion for us. For a few years now, we've been working with the Arthur Miller Society and the Arthur Miller Writing Studio, one on preserving the studio itself, and two on bringing programs like this to Roxbury, where Arthur Miller lived so much of his life. And this is the very first one. So thank you all for being here. We're really excited. Please make sure your cell phones are silenced if they are not yet. And without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Jane Dominik, who's the president of the Arthur Miller Society.
Good afternoon and welcome. It is my pleasure to be here with all of you this afternoon on behalf of the Arthur Miller Society and its members. The Society was founded by the late Stephen Santola in 1995 for the continued promotion and scholarship of Miller's work through our academic conferences and the Arthur Miller Journal. Traditionally, we sponsor an event on or near Miller's October 17th birthday, and we have long wished to have an event here in Roxbury, the town that was so beloved by him. So today, we are very pleased to partner with the Arthur Miller Studio Project to sponsor this special event. The project to move and preserve Arthur Miller's writing studio is near and dear to our hearts. Having such a remarkable building, even in its relatively small size, where Miller wrote every day when he lived in Roxbury from 1957 to 2005, not only celebrates his life and work, an important mission in itself, but also opens his works, passion, and vision to current and future generations of adults and youth alike. The Society anticipates leading the vital educational programming that will be part of the project once the studio is in place. Having visited more than 30 authors' homes and writing places in this country and overseas, I have enjoyed and come to recognize the inherent value in being able to stand and see where they created their work. This studio will provide that opportunity to so many as well. We thank you and applaud you and look forward to the many activities this writing studio will afford in the many coming years and decades. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Sarah Griswold, the president of the Arthur Miller Studio Project Board.
Thank you, Jane. Those were wonderful words. And I want to thank our co-sponsor, the Arthur Miller Society, for this. So many people have worked so hard to present this first ever program of the brand new Arthur Miller Writing Studio. In addition to the Society, I'd like to thank Teresa Roxburgh and the board of the Roxbury Library, who have given us an administrative and program home, as well as supporting our plans to move the studio to a location right next to the library. Connecticut Humanities has supported the Arthur Miller Writing Studio by making grants to support the organization and also to fund this program. So I would ask those of you who are Connecticut residents to please let your legislators know about the important work that Connecticut Humanities does in the state. I also want to thank the board of the Arthur Miller Writing Studio, which has been working hard since before the pandemic to craft a mission and vision for the studio, find supporters, and bring Rebecca Miller's vision, inspired idea to offer the studio to the public. And thank you to Rebecca Miller for getting this whole thing started. And a shout out to Mark Olivieri for helping her start to realize that. We welcome you to learn more about the site and what we are doing and to get involved with this new venture. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jack Gilpin, who will read Arthur's essay, Luck and the Death Penalty, and the conclusion to an unpublished work after the panel. Jack Gilpin has lived in Roxbury for 28 years, where he and his wife, Annie, raised their 3 children. 50 years ago, this past June, he received his first paycheck as a professional actor. And 12 years ago, this coming December, he was ordained a priest in the Episcopal Church, serving as the rector of St. John's, New Milford, until his retirement in 2020. So thank you, Jack.
Arthur Miller wrote the following essay to help the Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern Law School in its campaign to abolish the death penalty in Illinois. It was published in the 2017 anthology Anatomy of Innocence and in the New York Times as well. It is a small town, so everybody knew the boy. He was approaching 18, but he was slight, blonde, and soft-spoken, so he was referred to as a boy. His mildness made it hard for many to believe that he had butchered his mother, even after the state police announced that he had made a confession. In fact, the longer his trial went on, the fewer the folks who felt convinced of his guilt. Still, strange things do happen, and he was convicted and was actually in a car on his way to the state penitentiary when a group of residents raised enough money, some even mortgaging their homes, to lodge an appeal. And he was returned to the local jail. Basically a conservative community, many people there had rather unwillingly come to believe that the confession had somehow been forced out of him by the police. At the hearing to decide whether to give him a new trial, things did not look good. The second judge seemed a fair and sympathetic listener, but the defense, now under a new lawyer, was required to produce new evidence, not easy to get hold of. But several days into the hearing, the state's attorney who had gotten the boy convicted dropped dead on a golf course, and a substitute prosecutor immediately took his place and began studying his papers on the case. In the files, the substitute discovered an affidavit from a witness who swore that he and his wife had seen the boy in another part of town at the very moment his mother was being attacked and killed. This affidavit had been withheld from evidence, never introduced into the original trial, despite the witness being a policeman who had known the boy and had not the slightest doubt that he had recognized him. Introduced into the hearing the very next morning, the affidavit blew the state's case out of the water and the boy was freed. If the state of Connecticut had had a death penalty, the boy may well have been executed. The boy's mother had been nearly eviscerated, savagely mauled, and feelings of disgust and anger were aroused. Indeed, it was only the adventitious death of the prosecutor that saved the boy from a long sentence in a penitentiary that would probably have destroyed him, gentle and mild as he was. Connecticut is not normally considered a benighted state, but one with a very high income level and a high proportion of educated people. Yet this travesty happened there. Any honest supporter of the death penalty simply cannot avoid facing the high probability of mistaken verdicts, of which there are indeed many in this country. The nation's conscience forbids the state to kill innocent people. The death penalty makes the presumption that there are never going to be corrupt, ambitious, cowardly prosecutors and police who, afraid to admit they were wrong in arresting a suspect, go down to the end insisting on his guilt. That there are never honest mistakes in judgment, never any visual misidentifications, but that in each and every prosecution, the guilty verdict is invariably deserved. The boy, Peter Reilly, regained his freedom in Litchfield County because a prosecutor died at the propitious time, and because his neighbors believed in him and outsiders were moved to come to his aid. The life of the innocent cannot be allowed to depend on that much luck, nor the state's dishonored by pretensions of infallibility in absolutely every capital case that comes before its all but overwhelmed courts.
Thank you, Jack. Good afternoon. My name is Steve Marino, and I'm the editor of the Arthur Miller Journal. It is a pleasure for me to moderate this panel discussion on false confession and wrongful conviction. As Jane Dominik mentioned, the Arthur Miller Society traditionally has scheduled conferences and events to coincide with his October 17th birthday. These have always focused on Miller's extraordinary literary output of plays, fiction, and criticism. However, this year, in partnering with the Arthur Miller Studio Project here in Roxbury, we decided to highlight his political and social activism, which of course is legendary. For example, Arthur Miller refused to name names during his testimony at the House Un-American Activities Committee. He defended the rights of writers all over the world when he was president of International PEN. He attended the Nazi war trials, protested the Vietnam War, and was a Connecticut delegate to 2 Democratic conventions. He supported the Polish Solidarity movement and railed against the Tiananmen Square massacres. In 2001, Miller gave the annual Jefferson Lecture in Washington, D.C., and typically caused a stir with his controversial opinion on the disputed election between Al Gore and George W. Bush, in an essay that was later called Politics and the Art of Acting. When he died in 2005, the front page headline in the New York Times called him the moral voice of the American stage. No event typifies his commitment to justice more than his active involvement in the Peter Reilly case. In his book, Guilty Until Proven Innocent, the title we used for this event, Donald Connery described Arthur Miller as the catalyst who secured Roy Daly as Peter's lawyer and used his influence to secure press coverage and public support. Because it has been 50 years since Peter Reilly's arrest, we saw this as an opportunity to focus a panel discussion on contemporary issues of forced confession, false accusation, exonerating the innocent, and protecting civil rights. Each of the panelists has a unique point of view and experience with these issues. I'm confident that their discussion will be informative and lively. I would like to introduce each of them to you. Peter Reilly is a Connecticut resident and social activist. 50 years ago, when he was 18, he was accused of the brutal murder of his mother. He was interrogated for hours, coerced to confess, and eventually convicted. Over 2 years later, due to the efforts of his community and the intervention of Arthur Miller and William Styron, he was exonerated. Since then, Peter has been an advocate for reform of police interrogation methods, especially of young people. His efforts helped the passage of Connecticut's State Bill 1071 that limits the use as evidence of any admission, confession, or statement made by a person during a custodial interrogation by a law enforcement agency official if the law enforcement agency official engaged in deceptive or coercive tactics during such interrogation. Seated in the middle is Gaylord Salters. He is a New Haven resident who spent over 20 years in prison due to prosecutorial misconduct. Since his release in July of 2022, Salters has been advocating to overturn his conviction and raise awareness about the prevalence of wrongful convictions. He was one of the main organizers of the 7 Days of Truth and Proof rally series. He also has a growing writing and publishing career that he started when he was still incarcerated. Salters wrote his first novel, Money, Murder, and Drug Flow, in 2006, illustrating life in the drug trade. His second novel, Mama Bear, centers around a woman inspired by his own mother, Gloria Johnson. Also on the stage, seated next to Peter Reilly, is Peter Herbst. He is an attorney practicing in Torrington, focusing on land use, zoning, and real property. He is of counsel to the law office of James A. Welcome. He served on the legal team during Peter Reilly's first trial. It was his first criminal trial after passing the bar. In the ensuing years, he and Peter Reilly have spoken at many high schools about the case and the way the police handled it. Alex Taubes is a civil rights lawyer in New Haven. He specializes in gaining compensation for people harmed as a result of corporate or government negligence in lawsuits and class actions. He also has filed motions reducing the prison sentences of dozens of prisoners taking more than 951 years off prison sentences to allow for early releases, including Gaylord Salters Jr. He has represented non-governmental organizations, elected officials, unions, and individuals struggling for social, economic, environmental, and racial justice. And finally, Eva Bermudez Zimmerman of Sandy Hook is a labor organizer, educator, and political activist. Eva was the youngest plaintiff for the landmark school desegregation case, Sheff versus O'Neill, and volunteered for presidential candidate Al Gore when she was 12 years old, sparking, quite obviously, a lifetime commitment to organizing and activism. Eva was a Newtown councilwoman and was awarded Latina of the Year by the Connecticut State Legislature for her role as a sister in Connecticut Access Health Exchange, where she enrolled 7,000 people during the first 2 years of the Affordable Care Act. She also served as the first Latina Secretary of State for the State Democratic Party and is most recently recognized for acquiring 40% in the Democratic primary for Lieutenant Governor of Connecticut. I have asked each panelist to give an opening statement that may expand upon the bioinfo and highlight the areas of criminal justice and civil rights that each has worked on. I will then open the discussion with questions and items about issues such as illegal investigative techniques, prosecutorial misconduct, and false arrests. So we'll start with Peter. Thanks for
Well, okay, now I understand. Thank you. Hi, everyone. There are so many people here and not here that did so much for me years ago to keep me out of jail, to giving me support, coaxing me along, including Arthur Miller, who we were giving, there was a symposium at Aetna in Hartford, and my job was to go out in front of the crowd and introduce Arthur Miller. And I was a nervous wreck. needless to say. And he walked up and just patted me on the shoulder with a very confident smile on his face. Go ahead and do it. It'll be over in a couple of minutes. and that's how that went. It's interesting how I first met Arthur Miller, and that was I was with my stepdad or my dad, my Uncle Murray, and it was the summer between the conviction and changing of counsel for me, so we were starting to interview attorneys. And we drove and drove and drove through the woods of Litchfield County until we got down to this house in the woods, and the tall gentleman got in the car and went with us. I didn't know Arthur Miller. My driver's ed teacher's name was Arthur Miller, and that's who I knew. So anyway, he got in the car, and I didn't know, and everyone was chit-chatting and whatnot, and we went and we saw an attorney, Jacob Zeldes, first, and he wanted a tremendous amount of money that we didn't have, and I personally didn't care for him. When I first met Roy Daly, who had been recommended through the law firms that represented Arthur Miller, it was an immediate click when we walked in the room. And I didn't realize that both Jim Conway and Judge Daly later on, they were grilling me in this conversation that we had in Roy's office for an hour or 2 hours or whatever. I didn't realize they were trying to trip me up to see if there was something. I was just answering their questions. And when it all was said and done, Roy's position was he'd take the case if I wanted him. How could I not? Sorry, I get a little emotional when I think about this, but so many people came to my rescue. I still can't fathom it 100% today, but the people of Litchfield County, the people of Connecticut and beyond just did so much for me, and I am forever grateful. And I just don't know what else to say today. I want to absorb some of the information from you all and just try to process it all. And I think, Peter, would you like to say a few words?
I was looking around for Steve to see if he was going to come back. So this is familiar territory for Peter and I to be sitting.
You speak often.
We do, that's for sure. In 1973, I was raised in Litchfield County, and in 1973, I started working with Catherine Rohrbeck in North Canaan. Catherine had an office in North Canaan and one in New Haven. The office in North Canaan had been in her family since 1873. Her grandfather was a state Supreme Court justice. She wanted to maintain the office in North Canaan, but her heart was down in New Haven, where she was very much involved in a public interest civil rights law firm. She was the person who initiated Griswold versus Connecticut, which later laid the path for Roe v. Wade. She took on a lot of work. She was selected for the board of directors of the American Civil Liberties Union when I was working with her. She also defended Erica Huggins in the 1971 New Haven Black Panthers case. And during the time I was working for her, she spent time representing various defendants in South Dakota in Wounded Knee cases. She was retained to represent Susan Sachs, who at the time was on the lam. I don't know what ultimately happened, but I don't think Catherine ultimately represented her. I mention that because I think Catherine was the finest lawyer I've certainly ever encountered. And she was inducted in the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame in 2001. She was a 1949 graduate of Yale Law School, the only woman in her class. So 2 weeks after I started working with Catherine, the receptionist took a phone call and said, "You need to talk to this woman." She said, "There's been a murder and a young man is being arraigned in court this morning." So we found out where he was being arraigned. It was Peter. In Torrington. I had asked the receptionist where the Torrington court was. And I called Catherine and I said,
what I've just told you? And she said, what court, what time? That was it. No question she was going to be there, and she was. There was no physical evidence connecting Peter with a crime. He found his mother's mutilated body on the floor when he returned home on a Friday night from a church youth group meeting. And Father Paul, who conducted that meeting, is in the audience today. Peter immediately made calls for an ambulance. He called the hospital. He tried to reach a doctor at home, who he knew lived a few miles away. His presence during the day was accounted for. He was in school. He went to a friend's house, then to the church meeting, and had not gone home until after the church meeting. His whereabouts during the day were established. He had not had lunch. He had not had dinner. A neighbor had seen his mother outside the house during the day. The police strip searched Peter at the scene of the crime and found no marks on his body. There were no rips or tears on his clothing. There was no blood on his clothing or his bodies. After 26 hours with very little sleep, I think you said you may have tossed and turned for 4 hours at one point, and very little food, and after a lengthy lie detector test, which I sat through, I had to go maybe 8 different times to hear the test. It was so long. The state police would not give us a tape. They told Catherine, your associate can come to state police headquarters in Hartford and listen to it. So I would sit there and frantically, as fast as I could, write out what I was hearing on the tape, leave a lot of spaces between it, go back the next time, fill in. By about 8 times we had a book of what the police were doing to Peter. And it was the classic good guy, bad guy routine. The examiner repeatedly suggested to Peter how he had killed his mother. He suggested, could you have done this? Could you have done that? He kept telling Peter that he's a good boy. We just have to get this out of you. You're a fine young man, and I can understand why you would fly off the handle and do something like that, and that's why you don't remember it. Peter then confessed, I have that in quotes, to a crime that he had not committed. During the confession, I sat with the officer who conducted the lie detector test. It was all I could do to not get up and punch the SOB. The officer took breaks so that he could talk to the coroner, so that he could make sure that Peter was confessing to murdering his mother in the manner in which she was murdered. He had Peter confessing to stabbing her from the right to the left. And then he had to retract it because the coroner came back and said the wound was from the other direction. It's inconceivable to me. Here I was, 25 years old, sitting through this, and this police officer sitting there calm and quiet and confident over what he's doing to Peter. Peter woke up the next morning. He was in jail. He immediately recanted his confession. Notwithstanding, the confession was admitted into evidence at trial. I was shocked at that, but more so, however, Catherine was absolutely out of her mind that that could happen. She strenuously objected to that confession coming into evidence. She was very confident that the jury would find Peter not guilty, but they did not. The jury found him guilty. That, to me, I just couldn't believe that such an outrageous act of injustice could occur. I didn't think our system was like that. Catherine was less surprised. She was a seasoned attorney. So after a petition for a retrial was granted, the 53-year-old prosecutor, as Steve indicated, died of a heart attack. And if you read Don Connery's book, you can see where he died, probably because he realized the depravity that he had gotten involved in with the state police and what he had done. He was 53 years old when he died. And then shortly after that, the new, pardon me?
John B.
I'll mention his name. Yes, Father Paul. John B. Yankee. From your lips to mine, I heard that. But in any event, the new prosecutor was a friend of mine, and he, my partner and I had actually bought his practice when he became the new prosecutor. He was starting to prepare for the new trial. And one day, my door to my office just flew open, and there he was. He came running up to me. He said, "Look at this." He held me a statement out. It was a signed statement from an auxiliary state trooper saying that he had seen Peter in North Canaan, and it should have been disclosed to us. I worked with Catherine drafting the discovery motions. We asked for anyone over after a certain length of time, statements from anyone who had seen Peter. It was never disclosed to us. I said to this Dennis Santor, the young prosecutor, "What are you going to do with this?" He said, "I'm taking it to the sitting judge in Litchfield Superior Court." And I can remember, like Dennis was standing there, I said, "That's the right thing to do." I said, 2 days from now, this will be on the front page of the New York Times. And it was. Just a shocking case, and certainly changed my outlook as a young attorney in terms of looking at things a lot more closely than you want to look at, and make sure that things are being done properly in every manner of the law.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Stephen has already said my name, Gaylord Salters, and he mentioned that I spent 20 years wrongfully convicted, but I also have a sibling who spent 17 years wrongfully convicted, and we both were wrongfully convicted at the hands of the same corrupt prosecutor in 2 separate cases. And this was a hard thing for me because during my incarceration, he spoke about the books that I wrote. I became a published author because after trying to become published, I got a lot of rejection letters from big publishers. So I decided to start my own publishing company and started publishing books. So that second book that he talked about is Mama Bear, The Heartbreaking Struggle, Risks, and Results of Raising Minority Youth in Urban America. I started writing that book because I was in the cell with my brother at the same time. We're both wrongfully convicted by this predatory prosecutor. And for the first time in my life, I realized all that my mother had been going through, trying to raise us in that inner city environment. And at every turn, there's just so many pitfalls that people who come from what I come from don't usually thrive. But I wrote that book because I wanted to pay homage to my mother, who is watching today. Mom, I love you. So my brother got his freedom in 2013, and it resulted in a $16.8 million payout. And I was still in there fighting for my freedom, so I started organizing from my prison cell, holding demonstrations. I produced a documentary while I was in there, and these things started to bring me closer to the surface. And through coronavirus is when I got introduced to Mr. Taubes here, and he's one of the people that has a good heart. I could see it. He was for people who come from what I come from. And I get kind of emotional today when I hear Peter Reilly speaking, because it is a great feeling to have people come to your rescue.
It sure is.
It's an unbelievable feeling, right?
It sure is.
But where I come from, we don't have that. I'm just now uncovering a wrongful conviction crisis in the city of New Haven that has taken over, that has costed 1,000 years of wrongful convictions of people who look like what I look like, and we don't have people to come to our rescue. And so as I look in this room today and I see the faces, I see the interest, I ask you folks to come to our rescue. Pay attention to the crisis in New Haven. This is real. These outcomes are just heartbreaking. And when you don't have an avenue for recourse from a criminal justice system that is supposed to bring forth justice and instead allows deception and lies to be told in a venue of truth and justice, there's a significant problem. And without the people getting involved, it will remain that way. But what I've done since I've been out, while I was studying the crisis and I knew all the cases and I got all the information together and I had 7 days of proof of truth in my head, When I did get out, I started advocating about the wrongfully convicted because I know the feeling of not having someone come to your rescue. I was fortunate enough to be able to contact my brother and childhood friends and have them begin to organize the way that I wanted them to organize for me. But when I left out of that door, I knew there were a lot of other people who were wrongfully convicted. One who I'd spent time in the cell with in particular, prosecuted by the same prosecutor, and he rolled up here with me today, Darrell Valentine, whose case is currently in the Conviction Integrity Review Unit for the state of Connecticut. And that is a case that I really ask everyone to look at, because that case is going to dictate the way that these prosecutors do business in the state's attorney's office with the pressure that they have on them. And it's just been so far a slippery slope, the same old thing. If that prosecutor hadn't died, Peter, you would have died in prison more than likely. Now I have so many different cases like that, so many different people that I've spent time with, and now I'm starting to see them roll off of those courthouse steps. Adam Carmen spent 30 years wrongfully convicted because of the head prosecutor in the New Haven State's Attorney's Office. And this is in Judge Allender's decision, Judge Allenders, who reversed Adam Carmen's conviction, 30 years for killing a baby. So he has to live with that. People still think that he is a baby killer. There's no way he can shake that. Malik Jones just left off the courthouse steps 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, 30 years. He was set up by the same detective that set me up. So we're having these cases reversed in New Haven, and we need your attention, your help. So please pay attention. I am on Instagram at Injustice Amongst Us, and you can always find me on Facebook, Gaylord Salters. When you look through that, you'll see my whole fingerprint. The good thing is that from the 20 years that I was wrongfully convicted, I'm fighting my case, but I also started Go Get It Publishing, which is my business that kept me on track. So you'll see that fingerprint on Facebook all the way to my freedom, all the way to me advocating for the wrongfully convicted, up until now with me asking you folks, please give a voice to the voiceless. When you hear about these things, when you hear, if you follow me, you can just Google my name and the news will pop up all the time. So, you know, your voices count. Because like I said, in my community, a lot of times we're written off and we don't have a voice. But now more than ever, that is changing. So with that being said, I would appreciate all the assistance and support that you will give. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaylord, and thank you everybody for being here, and thank you for having me. And another way you can support is by buying a copy of Gaylord's book, which is in the room next door here and set up there. So after this is over, you should definitely check out Mama Bear. My name's attorney Alex Taubes. I'm a civil rights attorney in New Haven, Connecticut. I had the honor of representing Gaylord Salters and Darrell Valentine, who's who's here today. And in both of those cases, I did something. I represented them in a way that really had less to do with their guilt or innocence. In both of their cases, we went to the decision maker, certainly presenting the evidence of their innocence, certainly showing the lack of confidence that any reasonable person would have in their conviction. But we were begging for mercy in both of their cases. And we told the judge in Gaylord's case and the parole board in Darrell's case, you don't have to rule that the police lied or that the prosecutor did misconduct. But look at everything here. These guys also were in prison for decades without a single looking at the officer wrong, violation, or, and working and supporting their families from the big house, doing all of these things. And so they were granted that mercy. And in Gaylord's case, the sentence was reduced by a handful of years. I don't even remember the exact number. In Daryl's case, Daryl was wrongfully convicted of a double murder and was given 100 years. And the parole board reduced that sentence by 57 years. And his case is still being reviewed for potentially being reversed and expunged. But in my view, and in the view of a lot of people, there needs to be this avenue of mercy where there's some doubts. Maybe we can't convince the system to admit that it made a mistake, but can there be some doubts after some decades that maybe we can show some mercy on people? And so we had this process in Connecticut called a commutation. That's how Daryl got his freedom. And unfortunately, this year, that whole process got suspended and very drastically curtailed as a result of a certain political backlash to people like Daryl getting out of prison. And so, and if that's something that's news to you, I recommend that you look it up, because it affects people like Gaylord and Daryl and Peter, who are still behind bars, because the work of people like Eva to pass SB 1071 and to restrict these interrogations and these deceptive techniques, that's extremely important. And just as the police can get a person to wrongfully confess to a crime they didn't commit, I mean, it's hard for people sometimes to believe that you can convince a person to confess to a crime they didn't commit. But I think now at this point, most people can see through the cases of Peter Reilly and others that this is something that can happen. Well, if that can happen, it's much easier to get people to say something false about who committed a crime when it's not them. So if it's someone who's being interrogated and maybe the police have something on that person, maybe they have charges against that person, or there are charges against their mother or charges against their child, and the police don't need you to say, I did a murder or something like that. They just need you to say, that guy did it, right? So that type of coerced witness testimony can often be even worse than coerced confessions, because in Daryl's case, they will say, well, we had 3 witnesses. Well, let's take a look at that. Daryl had 2 trials. The first trial was overturned on appeal. At both trials, of the 3 people who the state put forward, 2 of them said, I never saw Daryl commit this crime. At both trials, they said, I never said that. And the prosecutor said, well, that's not what you told the police. And a tape was played of a coerced interview, of a coerced statement. So in Daryl's case, the only person who ever walked into court and said Daryl did it was a person who never said Daryl did it until years after the crime, and only after charges that he was facing were dropped after he was extradited from another state to be brought up to testify in Daryl's case. So no person who didn't get something actually ever testified that Daryl did it. Like Peter's case, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. And so we have these deceptive interrogations, witness coercion. Another thing we have is people in jail are incentivized to say, my cellmate confessed to me he committed this crime he's in jail for. Now, the cellmate gets to go free because he just solved a murder. They call that the jailhouse snitch, right? And then also we have junk science that's used in trials and are still used in trials. I mean, here in, I think, is it Litchfield County, New Milford? We have the case of Birch and Henning, where the state's superstar forensic scientific laboratory person, Henry Lee, was found to have lied about the existence of blood on a towel. And two people who had no blood on them, who were blamed for a very bloody murder, spent 30 years each in prison behind that. And I represent an individual who is currently in jail who had Henry Lee testify at his trial. Of course, he was called away from the trial before his lawyer was allowed to cross-examine Henry Lee. And all the judge did was say, okay, jurors, just disregard what Henry Lee just told you. Just forget that. So we have a long way to go here in Connecticut. And oftentimes you look at these cases, it can seem complicated, or there's lots of things that you have to go into this deep research. And what I try to say is, let's make sure we have some of these avenues of mercy so that people can get out of jail when there are these questions. And then when they're out of jail, we can continue to seek truth and justice and try and find out what happened. So in Daryl's case, the New Haven State's attorney could still say his conviction should be overturned because they've investigated it and it's on their desk to make that decision. And in Gaylord's case, it's the same. So that's what we're doing, and thank you all for listening.
Eva Bermudez Zimmerman, and yeah, thank you for, my goodness. It still boils my blood hearing stories like yourselves and the lawyers involved in it. That's the organizer in me. I'm sure most of you are, looking and thinking about when did you hear about a case and thought about the injustice. But I want you to look a little deeper. Oftentimes we read an article, we glance at it, we think about the individuals who are impacted, we feel for them, and then we put it down, we walk away, and we do nothing. So that moment lives right there, and we walk away. My first introduction to Arthur Miller, like most Americans, was English literature, right? You read a play, you read an essay, you hear a story like Peter's, and again, you read it, you're impacted in the moment, you analyze it maybe with a professor, a friend, a loved one, and then you forget that there's someone behind it who actually lived that scenario, who maybe Arthur Miller, the Millers of their time, wrote about that person. Artists create the opportunity, the very unique opportunity, to magnify social circumstances, to take very heartfelt, disappointing, agonizing moments in all of our lives and put it front and center for us to really internalize. Now, it's our job as citizens of this world and being human to each other to do something about it. That's the main role of an organizer. I've been professionally organizing, and I say professionally because organizer at birth, involuntarily. My parents signed me up to be a plaintiff at the Sheffield O'Neill case, like Stephen mentioned, when I was 2. So you don't really have much of a choice when you're 2 to decide if you're going to be involved in civil rights.
I have a 2-year-old, so I can do that.
You can do that. Legally, they let you. But professionally, I've been working as an organizer 16 years now. And I know in my younger years, when I tried to run away from what my parents were fighting and make things my own, I took the route of plays and art, and I decided to do an arts program for high school, and that was my introduction. And in analyzing those plays and analyzing those struggles, every single time we had a more difficult subject, it brought me closer to that organizing, to the roots that my parents were instilling in me, that foundation. And my navigating those roots brought me to organizing with Conperk. Some of you might have heard it. Ralph Nader, short version here. Ralph Nader, who's known for the seatbelts, created different social groups, PIRGs, progressive investment groups that you're able to then organize on topics. One of them really concentrated on environmental organizing. So at 16, I was working door knocking, trying to mobilize people about the environment, and door after door after door, New Haven, Hartford, all through the state of Connecticut, people were not interested, most people were not interested in having conversations about carbon footprint or how our air quality is poor. They wanted to have conversations about being able to pay their bills, be able to have their loved ones not be in jail, mental health, the beginnings of the opioid crisis. And at 16, to be bombarded by all these struggles, you really start wondering, what is your path? What is your future? So my pathway in organizing took a more civil rights, going back to my roots, approach that led me to organizing for labor, led me to doing community activism, and now sitting as a board member of the ACLU. When we concentrate on these cases, the lobbying, the amount of effort it takes to convince the people in power to change this It's those heartfelt stories that you have to repeat over and over and over again. One story like Gaylord's or Peter, unfortunately, when you're trying to convince someone who is elected, is not enough. You would think it'd be enough, considering the harsh reality that they had to live. But if you go to the average legislator, especially someone who's been there sitting in that seat for 20 plus years, they are so desensitized to all the stories that they've heard for all the topics and subjects that they expect to change, that they have no bandwidth for reality anymore. So it becomes our imperative as citizens to either get them out, elect them out of there, or to push the topic that we feel is, the most important, and make sure that they're supporting that legislation. So hopefully we're gonna have opportunities to talk about activism and organizing and how it relates to criminal justice reforms. But please don't forget to be involved, vote, be engaged, and don't give the people in power so much authority over you that the system continues to be broken.
Well, I guess my follow-up, to all of you is we get shocked when we hear these stories about prosecutorial misconduct. And the question is, why the lack of accountability for police and prosecutors? Where are the sanctions for this? Why aren't they held accountable for all of this? So I don't know if anyone has a comment about that, but as I said, you're experiencing yourself having trouble with the system. You mentioned it too, how people are judges, legislators, they're ensconced in their positions. So it's difficult to get movement in laws. You're very successful in passing this recent law, but as citizens, we want to see more movement and more accountability for the people who have done an injustice.
I mean, we hear a lot in the news after the murder of George Floyd about the concept of qualified immunity, and that's basically a structure in our government that protects police officers, even when they make mistakes, if they're reasonable mistakes, from having to have sanctions against them. For prosecutors and in judges as well, that's actually an absolute immunity. It's not a qualified immunity. So a prosecutor may not be sued for anything that they do in relation to a criminal case as prosecution. And, so ultimately in cases like Birch and Henning, where the state just settled, it's the taxpayer who pays the sanction, and there's no giving back a person the time that they've lost from being wrongfully incarcerated, of course. But why do we have those policies? Well, the traditional reason for why these policies exist is because the role of the prosecutor and the police in fighting crime is so important. And it is important. It is extremely important that the police and the prosecutors fight crime. But just because it's important doesn't necessarily mean that there cannot be avenues of accountability that actually will strengthen the process and make it a better process, because when a person is wrongfully convicted, of course, the person who committed the crime goes free. And it's a big misconception that everybody in jail says that they're innocent, okay? That's not the case. I mean, I represent dozens and dozens of people in prison, and most of them were trying to just get mercy. We're not even arguing about guilt or innocence. But the vast, vast majority of prisoners I've met are guilty and admit their guilt. Actually desperate to seek forgiveness for their crime. The very few who have maintained a strong, credible claim of innocence from his prison cell for decades, I don't say I believe all of them. There's some I've met and I know. I see the evidence here and it's not really explained, but there are some studies say between 3 to 5% of American convictions are wrongful convictions, and it's more likely to occur for a more serious crime. So a lot of reforms need to take place to dismantle that.
I would say you're right. This keeps happening because of the absolute immunity. But first, before I go on a rant, I want to say this. I want to make it clear. I have nothing against prosecutors. I have nothing against police. I am seriously upset with good police, quote unquote, good police that turn a blind eye to corruption. I do not like prosecutors who turned a blind eye to corruption, because while you are quote unquote the good guy in the office, you know of all the corruption in the office. This is how it thrives, because he will not blow the whistle on his buddies. It's called institutional protectionism, and it is what we're experiencing now. But this is why I would like for everybody to pay attention to the Darrell Valentine case, because this is about accountability. They're reviewing his case. They actually exonerated him. Then they realized that, oh, he got a commutation. They walked it back. All of the bad things that they said about the police, they tried to get rid of that report, redo it, and say, nah, he doesn't deserve to get exonerated. But it got leaked. So remember that. And that is the Conviction Integrity Review Unit for the state of Connecticut right now. So they are in a little pickle with the Valentine case and my case as well. But when we talk about the accountability, yes, that's how it thrives. And one of the things that I let all of my partners know, I didn't tell everybody, I didn't get deep into 7 Days of Truth with Proof, but I had celebrities and a lot of good institutions, including the ACLU and a good friend, Gus Marks Hamilton, who came out on the second day back there for the ACLU. He came out for the second day of 7 Days of Truth with Proof and talked about the deceptive practices that led, to false convictions. But again, the accountability is a joke.
It's a far cry. I just wanted to add one more thing. I'm sorry, Gaylord. Gaylord's been mentioning this thing called Conviction Integrity Unit, and I thought I'd explain what that is. So throughout the United States, so a person like Peter filed what's called a petition for a new trial, right? So after you're convicted, you file something in court saying, I deserve a new trial. And that's like the way, that's open in Connecticut. You can still file a petition for a new trial or a habeas corpus action. But I mentioned the commutation process, that's outside of the courts to get relief. A Conviction Integrity Unit is an office within the prosecutor's office. So in Connecticut, the chief state's attorney is in Rocky Hill. They have a unit which exists for the purpose of reviewing cases themselves. And if they themselves discover that a case loses its evidence, or there's no evidence to support the conviction, they are supposed to themselves come to court and say, we're not going to stand behind this anymore. There are 95 offices like this around the country. Connecticut's is one of 43 of those offices that has never actually exonerated anyone. It's existed for over 2 years. And Darrell Valentine's case, this is the reason why we keep bringing him up, was the first case that went fully through the unit, and they produced a 60-page report with attachments where they found plausible, verifiable evidence of his innocence, both in terms of discrediting those witnesses I talked about earlier and also police official misconduct. And there's a report that says police misconduct. Then Darrell got out, and they found out, and then they made a new report. And the new report after Darrell was released from prison doesn't say police misconduct in it anywhere. But the problem is that they had shown me a copy of the draft report prior to changing it, and we were able to get our hands on the draft report. So when they changed the report, then the recommendation changed from vacating Darrell's conviction to doing nothing. And so that recommendation of do nothing has sat on the desk of the chief New Haven state's attorney, John Doyle, for almost a year now. And that decision is yet to be made. So that's what we're talking about, Conviction Integrity Unit. So I apologize, I've been going on, but yeah.
I wanted to add that the criminal justice system nationwide is broken from the very beginning. So when you're thinking of the example that Gaylord gave in difference to Peter's case, that there's not a community that he had access to help him exonerate him and push his innocence like Peter did. That situation happens time and time again, and unfortunately, color is in play here. I'll give a quick example of a case of a woman I'm helping right now. I have a childcare provider that 7 months ago was accused of third-degree assault. She's a childcare provider, of course, no names here, privacy purposes. Third-degree assault for assaulting a state inspector in order to keep her childcare license viable. And even though she had a camera footage from the Ring camera, she had 2 physical witnesses that saw that there wasn't an assault happening. The police officer who came to the scene, because they spoke to a state agent, filed third-degree assault. They arrested the provider for third-degree assault. Now, here's a woman who doesn't have a criminal history. She's a Black woman in an urban environment in a poor area, who all of a sudden is now in the court system. And I'm trying to help her navigate with her lawyer this horrible circumstance. Her public defender, she's already had 2 in the course of 6 months. You know, the first one quit, the second one relocated. And the third one now is telling her, just plead guilty because you don't have a prior record. You'll go through a extended, like a quick rehabilitation program. It'll be expunged in your file very quickly. Now, easy to say, right? When you're trying to get rid of a case, and this is the best advice that you can give because she doesn't have prior arrests, but this is her livelihood. The minute she has a record, even for a short duration, she can't re-up her childcare license. She is flagged with the state of Connecticut. You know, this is just one scenario of a very quick example where she has very clear evidence. And imagine all the other scenarios in people's lives that are impacted, that are falling through the cracks because one police officer made the decision to not fully analyze the circumstance and make that charge. From beginning to end, there are holes and cracks in how our judicial system works, and that's problematic. So I just want to highlight that.
Gaylord, I'm pleased that you mentioned something about your feelings towards the police, because Arthur Miller once said about Peter's case, he said, we need the police. He said, we need the police. We need their principled upholding of the law. I think the key word is principled. So this is an Arthur Miller event. Peter, I was wondering if you can expand a little more about the relationship that developed between you and Miller. And also, I know I mentioned this in my remarks, you've gone around educating high school students about your experience. I think we'd like to hear that experience of the students too.
Thank you. I never wanted to bother Arthur Miller with my issues. I mean, other than the case, but on a day-to-day thing, there were a couple of times that I called him up and asked his advice on things. And he was always very welcome to hear my voice. And I always felt like I'm putting this man out. He's so important compared to me, but that was not the case, and certainly not the case from his point of view. And he was always very quick to speak to me. And I will always appreciate that. And I know my mom up there, she really appreciates it. Something I wanted to talk about just for a moment was the process here in Connecticut to become a state's attorney. And I guess they're appointed. You don't see any state's attorney on your ballot when you're voting or anything like that, as some other states do. But I think there needs to be a moratorium on some of these prosecutors, because they go from there to the bench. That's the next step. And I feel there should be a 5-year moratorium from when you leave the office of the state's attorney to when you can be appointed to the bench. And that's really all I have to say at the moment. Thank you.
So Eve, you've done a lot of work with ACLU. Can you give us some advice about what we should know about our rights and how citizens protect themselves? I think that would be informative.
I'm gonna bring out my notes for this one because I gotta give credit where credit is due. Claudine Constant, Gus Marks Hamilton's here, so ACLU team members. I am merely an organizer, and a board member of ACLU, but I give much credit to Gus and Claudine and Anderson and their team to make this happen. So when it comes to knowing your rights, and more recently, first and foremost, make sure that in any circumstance you ask a lot of questions, know that you have a voice, that there are laws on your side. With more systematic issues, bigger issues, let's say trans rights, voting expansion, know that ACLU is here. Every year, there are a handful of topics that you might hear happening nationally impacting you, or even locally, that the ACLU National and ACLU Connecticut do take on. The team members go through 4,000 calls, emails, and intake requests a year, and they're all reviewed. So if you've ever written to the ACLU about an issue here locally or nationally, believe me, there's someone reviewing it. If you're ever arrested, and I know that Julia has some really helpful informational cards of like know your rights, know that if you're a passenger sitting next to someone who's driving, they don't have the right to ask for your ID. They don't have, more obvious ones. They don't have the right to ask you to leave your car or get out of the car unless there's probable cause. So you ask the police officer, is there probable cause? Ask them, why are they stopping you? What is the problem here, officer? In cases outside of a traffic violation or a moving violation, and let's say you're visiting my turf, a rally, a picket, a demonstration, that circumstance of maybe uneventful interaction with a police officer, once more, you have the opportunity and the ability to ask them, why are you detaining me? Why are you arresting me? Especially if you're in a demonstration or a rally that's a peaceful demonstration and there aren't any rioters physically present. Overall, here in Connecticut, we are very fortunate that we're not in the South, and there are oftentimes in the many events I've been to advocating for different topics that impact people. Most of the time, police officers are very kind, they're very patient, they're not looking to get into a fight or an argument. So you do have a lot of room to, show your sign, be outspoken. But if you're ever in that interaction where it goes negative, the best advice that I can give you is to speak up, ask lots of questions, make sure you ask for representation. You are entitled to representation. And if you're not someone who's in a situation where you have the income or ability to hire a lawyer or have a lawyer, in 24 or 48 hours notice, then ask for other types of representation. Ask for a witness or someone physically there. I'll pass it out over to Alex and some other of the team members here.
Yeah, and I was just reflecting on the essay that Jack read earlier about the death penalty. And, one thing that I think people need to be aware of is that in Connecticut, although we've abolished the death penalty, the abolition of the death penalty was concomitant with an extreme spike in the length of prison sentences. So whereas during the era of the death penalty in Connecticut, a life sentence was 20 to life, and a person could get a hearing where they could potentially get out approximately 20 years or earlier. Now a life sentence is 60 years. And so, so that tripling of the sentences, and by the way, they're ineligible for parole if it's a murder, and there's no guarantee of any hearing or anything until 60 years is up. So that's something I think needs to be looked at as well. And I think that culturally, we'll often read something in the news and we'll say, that person only got this many years for that, or 20 years for that. And I think we sometimes forget that, with really serious crimes, of course, there's not going to ever be an amount of years that's like equivalent to the crime. But if we have these extremely long sentences as a society, you potentially create the same dilemma that Arthur Miller raised about the death penalty, which is that innocent people can be killed by the sentence if it's 60 years long, you know? So that's just something to consider.
Just a follow up for Gaylord. It's a quote that you have. You said, exoneration is everything. You're out, but you said it's just not enough. So can you let us know about your process and your seeking your exoneration?
All right. So the truth of the matter is this. I told you about my brother who was wrongfully convicted, and it resulted in a $16.8 million settlement with the state. He had gotten his freedom, and he was out of state pursuing a music career, promotions, and unfortunately he was murdered. And so this is what I talk. This is heavy. I'm really giving my story no justice in this little bit of time trying to explain, but this is the heavy type of stuff that my mother, that we deal with in our communities. But he was murdered, and I was still in, and I was fighting for my exoneration. But as I told you, I had started my company, Go Get It Publishing, from the inside. So I stayed focused on my fighting my case, running my business, writing novels and preparing screenplays for Netflix. And at the same time, I had came to the point of the prosecutor's office saying, okay, you have enough evidence for us to review your case and exonerate you on your own. So while I was waiting for that process is when my brother was murdered. So I didn't have any plans on going home. I was not going to file for that modification that I filed for with Alex Taubes, and that's what brought me home. I was going to sit, because I've sat in 20 years, and I was going to wait for you to do justice, which was supposed to come. But so I got the modification and I came home. And I say exoneration is everything because as I came home, I need to provide for my family. 20 years gone, I got this company, I need to do all that I can. So I started and I hit the ground running, and my book has been mentioned all throughout the country and in other countries, in Canada in particular. Now, I need to be exonerated so that I can go to Canada and capitalize in those markets, because Canada is not so friendly with convicted felons. And so when you talk about exoneration is everything, exoneration puts me in a position of freedom, whereas I'm still in a position of being held back, even though I have been accomplishing these unbelievable feats since I've been home, right? And it's just, I need a shot at life. Without exoneration, I will still have these walls that come up in front of me. Attorney Taubes, you know how this is. I mean, it's just really, really hard stuff. So the exoneration is everything. But I just wanted to say one thing before I pass it to you, because she had mentioned something about paying respect to the people who help and everything, and often I forget because I'm doing so much, and once I accomplish something so big, I just let it go ahead so I don't get stuck on that in one place, continue to move forward and accomplish things. But 7 Days of Truth with Proof was a 7-day protest in which I had a phenomenal amount of partners come through and fight for justice with me. And I often forget to name them in situations like this as I'm asking for your support. So I will let you know that I want to pay respect to Criminal Justice Chairperson Scott X. Estelle from the NAACP. The NAACP backed me. The ACLU, of course, as I said, Gus Marks Hamilton came out and did a presentation. I had Kalia Ali, who is Muhammad Ali's daughter. She is a civil rights advocate, no different from her father. He's the champion in the ring. She's the champion on the outside. I had Yale University Law and Racial Justice Center, Ray Boyd and Kayla Vincent and Ariane Lewis and the New England Innocence Project, Stephanie Hartung, Sean K. Ellis from the riveting Netflix series Trial 4, Jeffrey Deskovic from the Deskovic Foundation out of New York City, which really, you shake your head, you're familiar with Jeffrey. All right. So Jeffrey Deskovic, like Peter, was wrongfully convicted. Police forced him to confess on himself. And he confessed. He spent, I think it was 17 years in prison, but he had known of me. I reached out because as I was making all of these connections, I reached out to him, told him my story. He knew about my brother, and we just connected. So he came down. Cardozo School of Law, Derek Bush. I mean, I know it's some that I'm forgetting off top. Next Level Empowerment Program, their reentry program in the city of New Haven. I sit on their board. So there's a lot of things going on, a lot of people who are involved, celebrities and just people who are big in the area of wrongful conviction and justice. But often it's so many partners that I have. And I know I forgot a few, I'll probably remember it later, but I forget to mention their names because there's so many, but I just wanted to do that. And again, I thank everybody for giving your undivided attention to something that is so absolutely critical. All right.
Thank you. We're discussing here whether I should read Saul Kassen's article. Saul Kassen wrote a book. The title of the book was Duped. And it has chapters on Peter Reilly's case and on other similar situations. So this includes Amanda Knox. This is Saul Kassen's The 50-Year Legacy of Barbara Gibbons. On September 28, 1973, 50 years ago, Barbara Gibbons of Canaan, Connecticut was sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. Ms. Gibbons, 51 years old, lived in a small one-bedroom house with her 18-year-old son, Peter Reilly. Looking back, Peter describes his mother as 100% parent, all about me. When Peter came home from a church youth center that night, he called out, "Hey, Mom, I'm home," but she didn't answer. There he found her lying naked on the bedroom floor, on her back, eyes closed, in a pool of blood. Her throat had been slashed. Mercifully, it is hard for most of us to fathom Peter's mental and emotional state at that horrific moment that he was orphaned. He went into the kitchen and he called for an ambulance. Then he called a doctor and the local hospital, which contacted state police. Within minutes, emergency personnel arrived, only to find Peter in a corner. His mother was pronounced dead. What happened next demonstrated the kind of egregiously misguided law enforcement work that risked the entrapment and wrongful conviction of innocent people. Make no mistake, when police and prosecutors close a case on an innocent person, the villainous perpetrator remains free on the street, poised and likely to reoffend, and the victim's family and friends are denied a sense of closure. To this day, Peter Reilly is frustrated that his mother's killer was never sought and brought to justice. Immediately upon arrival and without any serious investigation, police determined that Reilly was suspicious. Reilly, a high school senior who had started to play guitar in a rock band, was a good kid. No witnesses or physical evidence implicated him. His body and clothing were clean. He loved his mother, had no history of violence, and had never been in trouble before. Yet at 2 a.m., he was hauled into the state police barracks and deemed a suspect because of what a sergeant described as his cool and unemotional demeanor. Spoiler alert, over the years, research has completely discredited conventional police wisdom that lying reveals itself in a person's face, body, posture, emotionality, and other aspects of demeanor. There is no right way to react to trauma. Forming a suspicion on a baseless hunch, police read Reilly his Miranda rights to silence and to counsel, which he reflexively waived because, As most innocent but wrongfully convicted defendants later explained, he had nothing to hide. Growing up in a small town, he trusted local law enforcement. I hadn't done anything wrong, and this is America, he would later say on CBS 60 Minutes. Through the night and into the day, the traumatized son of Barbara Gibbons was interrogated alone, without family present or a lawyer. During the course of 8 hours of questions, accusations, and denial, in the alternating presence of 4 officers, Reilly agreed to take a polygraph, quote, lie detector test, end quote, in a session that was tape recorded. As scripted, he was then told he failed the test, a test that was infallible. Pete would go strictly by the charts, he was advised, and the charts say you hurt your mother last night. False polygraph feedback was, and still is, a common but dangerous ploy in the interrogation business. For Peter, the experience was disorienting as he underwent a chilling mental transition and came to question his own innocence. The test is giving me doubts right now, he said, told that he must have blocked the event from consciousness, which is why he cannot remember it. Reilly later inferred that, well, it really looks like I did it. Later still, he confabulated a memory and confessed to slashing his mother's throat with a straight razor he used for model airplanes. Based on this confession, which he recanted shortly thereafter, Reilly was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted at trial. Everyone in town who knew Reilly at the time instinctively knew that the story made no sense, that he was not capable of such violence. Connecticut-based playwright Arthur Miller, the same Arthur Miller who wrote The Crucible and Death of a Salesman, mobilized a rescue effort. Others in town also rallied in his support. And then they mentioned that he mentions the new prosecutor combing through the case file discovered independent evidence, which I had mentioned, that Peter could not have committed the murder, and the confession even he came to believe was false. The writer continues, for me, there is an intensely personal component to the story. Peter and I are about the same age. While I was just starting out in the social psychology PhD program at UConn and Storrs, his life was upended and derailed in Litchfield County. Just a few years later, I read the Barthel and Connery books about the case while breaking open the scientific study of false confessions. For me, Reilly became the poster child for a type of false confession that was unheard of at the time. In 1985, my colleague Larry Reitzman and I coined the term internalized false confession to describe this most unimaginable phenomena by which an innocent person not only succumbs to the pressure to confess, but shockingly comes to believe in his own culpability. Donald Connery closed his book by asking, how many more Peter Reillys are there? It is not possible to come up with a precise number or even a good estimate, but this phenomenon has been observed all over the world. The Innocence Project, founded in 1992, reports that an astonishing 29% of its post-conviction DNA exonerations in the US involved false confessions and evidence. It's almost 1 in 3. Some number of these were of the internalized type. My sure answer to the how many more are there. My sure answer to the how many more are there question is too many. Peter and I first met in 2006 when I invited him to visit my psychology and law class at Williams College in Western Massachusetts. 30 plus years had passed. He and Don Connery came up together. His appearance was mesmerizing and a source of inspiration. We have since stayed in touch, occasionally talking by phone. Peter lives in Tolland, just a few miles from the university. Together, he and I have fondly recalled a historic appearance of the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show and the effect it had on our love of music and bands like the Grateful Dead. He plays guitar in 3 or 4 rock bands. He and Don Connery had become close friends. In January of 2021, Connery died at the age of 94. 50 years ago, Barbara Gibbons was brutally murdered in her own home. If that wasn't bad enough, her son Peter was wrongfully accused of the crime and convicted. Perhaps there is a silver lining in this double tragedy. Most Americans don't know this, but the US Supreme Court permits police by law to outright lie about evidence to suspects they interrogate in pursuit of a confession. You failed the polygraph. Your fingerprints were found on the victim, and surveillance footage places you at the scene are some common but brazen lies told to children and adults. Predictable from basic psychology research, this tactic has induced countless innocent people to confess to murders and other crimes they did not commit. This past summer, Connecticut became one of just a handful of states to pass a bill that prohibits police from knowingly presenting false evidence to suspects under the age of 18. They also may not misrepresent the law or make promises of leniency. It's about time. Fittingly, reform advocate Peter Reilly strongly supported this legislation, which Governor Lamont signed into law in June. Nearly 50 years later, Reilly had earlier written in Connecticut Post, "I am appalled that Connecticut still allows these tactics to be used against kids. The cases of Connecticut's exonerees, including myself, demonstrate that confessions derived through deceptive tactics cannot be trusted." This new law, set to take effect in October, will memorialize Barbara Gibbons and Peter Reilly in the best of ways. Aimed at preventing wrongful convictions, the benefits to future generations will stand as an enduring legacy. Saul Casson is the Distinguished Professor of Psychology at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. He's a Professor Emeritus at Williams College in Massachusetts. As I mentioned, he's the author of Duped, Why Innocent People Confess and Why We Believe Their Confessions.
Just want to point out that Peter mentioned to me when we met that he was frustrated that his case became known as the Peter Reilly case, but from a legal standpoint, it's actually the Barbara Gibbons case. His mother was the one who was murdered. And 50 years later, there has not been any justice for his mother. And I think it was Don Connery who said that the police and prosecutors have left it the coldest of cold cases. So we're going to end this portion of the discussion now. I'm going to turn it back over to Jack Gilpin, who's going to read another excerpt from Arthur Miller, an unpublished piece from Miller, and then I'm going to turn it over to questions and answers from you. Jack?
Arthur Miller gave the June 1977 commencement speech at Torrington High School, and he chose Peter Reilly's story as his subject. And this is the conclusion of that speech. I have given this case a good deal of time, and for some good reasons. In the past 15 years, I have had responsible positions in an organization, one of whose primary aims is to help writers anywhere in the world who are persecuted by their governments. For over 4 years, I was president of International PEN, an organization of writers in over 60 countries. I have negotiated with regimes to release writers from prison or to ameliorate their conditions. If there is one conviction I have come away with as a result of this experience, it is that the police power can never be allowed to pass the boundaries of the most exact and careful civilian control. Power corrupts, and it corrupts anyone who is not extremely careful to guard against that corruption. For this reason, the Reilly case and its importance goes beyond Reilly or the individuals who wronged him. It is not enough that Reilly is freed. We must ask the political leadership of this state, the governor and the legislature, to make absolutely clear why this prosecution went wrong and to devise the legislation and the administrative resolve to be sure it can never happen again. I want to tell you in closing that the area of freedom in this world has been narrowing decade by decade. You must not imagine that your freedom is a gift from the past which needs no effort on your part to keep. If we are free, and I believe we are the freest people in the world now, it is because Americans have treasured their freedom and have been watchful of any trespass over it. No department of government, none whatever, has the right to act in violation of its mandate in law. The checks and balances of our system rest upon this. Reilly is free. The governor, as our chief judicial officer, must now act to remove the pall of doubt and distrust which this case has thrown over the administration of justice in our state. It remains unclear to this moment whether Reilly is still the chief suspect, or whether the investigative forces are pointed towards others, as 2 judges have now demanded. The last action of the governor, sending Mr. Gormley to investigate his own department and his own friends, came to nothing, and has been reprimanded strongly by Judge Sponzo's report. It is not too much to say that the public belief and confidence in the rule of law rather than man depends on Governor Grasso's restoration of the rightful functions of the departments of this government. So I have given you sad news and glad news to carry off with you. Only remember that there are not many places on this earth where police and government can even be openly discussed, let alone criticized. We are a lucky people, and we must hold on to it forever.
Thank you, Jack. Before I open the floor to questions and answers, I'd like to thank a few special individuals who contribute mightily to the success of this event. Of course, our wonderful panelists, the board of the Arthur Miller Studio Project, and the officers of the Arthur Miller Society. And special recognition must go to Teresa Roxburgh for her permission to use this wonderful space, Jack Gilpin for his fine reading of Miller's work, the late Don Connery, whose book inspired the title for this event. We are privileged to have here Stuart Daly, who's Roy Daly's wife, and she connected us with Peter. Kayla Vinson, the executive director of the Law and Racial Justice Center at the Yale Law School. She connected us with Gaylord and Alex. Doc Simont, who lent us his father, Marc Simont's original artwork from Peter's hearing, which is displayed in the library. Connecticut Humanities for their generous grant that made this possible. Our videographer, Alexa Farrell, and I don't want to neglect Julia Bolus of the Miller Trust, and none of this would have happened without her efforts. She's a hero. Questions and answers? Questions? They'll give the answers.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
I just wanted to verify the judge in your appeal case was Judge John Spezialy.
Yes, he was. Now, that wasn't actually, yeah, he was a trial judge. And then we filed our appeal, but we sued the state while we were waiting on the appeal. And that he saw over those hearings.
Judge John Spezialy was my uncle. My name is Jim Kosis. He was married to Mary Kosis, who was from Torrington. Mm-hmm. He also went on to become the Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court. And with his Italian friends in Torrington, he started a golf course and a restaurant called East Lawn in the east end of Torrington. After the Peter Reilly appeal, the Connecticut State Police did not like my uncle.
I've heard those stories.
Yeah, they started rumors that he was running a mafia joint in his restaurant in Torrington. And my uncle, who was probably the world's most virtuous man that I've ever known, became so disgusted and so upset that he retired from being the Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court and dropped out of public life because of the police blowback from your case.
I've always admired him because he turned over what happened in his courtroom, and that's nearly unheard of.
Yeah, he was a magnificent man.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you for it. Thank you for it.
I'm humbled and honored to be in the presence of such fabulous, dedicated people. After retiring, I put on Facebook that, I liked outdoor activities, blah, 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 and I was an activist in a very small way. I'm in Southbury, and I don't know if anybody else here. We have, since George Floyd passed away, was murdered, I'm sorry. We have every week, every Sunday at 2:00, met on the corner. This is called Justice Southbury. And we are there every quarter, every Sunday for 180 Sundays to learn and to support justice for all people. I wish I had more of my colleagues with me, but I will certainly try to find out how we can view this because it's so important. I became very interested, as many of you did, in the idea of people being accused and jailed innocently. With the Innocent Project, and also they have a book called Surviving Justice, riveting stories. I encourage you to read that. Also, hopefully all of us have seen Brian Stevenson's work in his book. I believe the book is also called Just Mercy. And the movie, was that also called Just Mercy?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you haven't seen them, and this brings anything, to you, then you've got to see them, please. But I'm sure there's people in this audience that are just far more important and involved than I am, and I can't say enough about all of you. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you for sharing.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm from New Milford. I am the artistic director at the Sherman Playhouse. I'm also on staff at Longworth Theater in New Haven. So I'm coming with theater as survival, theater as bearing witness, theater as life. I'd like to ask Gaylord especially, can you talk about the role of writing, art, your novels, your screenplays, the relationship of art and writing especially to your life now and your story?
So, thank you. So when I wrote my first novel, I come from an underserved community, New Haven. All of the chaos that was there in the 80s, 90s, the war on drugs. So I always say that I'm a product of my environment, which is true, and I've made bad choices in my life, none which deserve the way that I was treated. However, my first novel was an entertaining novel about the underworld, the economic underworld, and money, murder, and drug flow. And it was nice. A lot of people liked it. And then the church, I have a church background, so I've always been in the church. My mother was proud of the book. She was happy that I wrote the book, but the church folks were even happier, and they wanted a copy, and they kept on knocking at the door. And my mother was like, you can't, the church people don't need to be reading this. So that's when I had the conversation with my brother that I was gonna write something for mommy. And so I have written that, and really a lot of my books, a lot of my works now are like art imitating life and about restorative justice. Like I have a book that is coming out. It's called The Alderman, a raw chronicle of inner city African-American leadership. And I'm putting this book out because it shows people who come from what I come from in a different role. Now, a lot of us have been confined to these spaces, these environments, right? And we don't have these resources. And then whenever a resource comes to that environment, you use it. Unfortunately for the African-American community, cocaine was a resource for taking care of your family. It was an ends to a means. It wasn't something that people wanted to get into, but when you are out here trying to put food in your stomach, just the basics, that is what comes along when you have those resources. So I just write about that type of stuff, and then I challenge myself also. I have a book, Power and Prestige, to go outside of the inner city and write about this very prestigious family they have this son who really is like a mess up to the rich people. Like, they're in California, the son, he messes up, they want to cover it up, they move to their Connecticut, to the country home. So I just do different projects, a lot of diversity, because I want to keep myself challenged, but I always like to write about what is happening in order to stay with the times. And I have another manuscript that I really haven't talked too much about, because Mama Bear, The Heartbreak and Struggle, Risks and Results of Raising Minority Youth in Urban America is a book that is near and dear to me, and is a book that me and my mother are going to tour this country and talk about this story, right? So I am focused on that. And my other works I will put into play after that. But being that everything is synced up, wrongful conviction and what's going on here, I continue with that. But overall, like I said, it's about art imitating life and inspiration. And one thing I want to say before I close is that you would wonder, like, how could you run a company from prison? I ran the company and also gotten a global distribution deal while I was in prison. And that was towards the end when I was coming out for the modification. But
Judge was like,
everything that I've done with myself in prison was like undeniable. I knew I was gonna get the modification. That's why I say the judge was like, but my daughter, my firstborn, Gabrielle Amani Salters, held it down. Because I started that company because we don't have generational wealth in my community. And I was not going to die in that prison cell without creating opportunity for generational wealth.
good for you.
So when we talk about that, my daughter Gabrielle was the outside man. She ran the company. She would take the orders that I would get. She would make the connections and she would execute. She's in the other room right now, and you'll get to meet her in person. So that's what really inspired me.
Yes. For the two Peters, if I may. In the half century since this crime and misdeeds by the police, has there ever been any recovery, acceptance of blame, or anything from the police, the state police?
Well, how do you mean recovery?
Did you sue them? Was there a remuneration of some sort for you for what you
There
went
was
through?
not. Yeah. After everything had been dropped and I was finishing up or getting ready to go back to high school, actually, so I could finish it up. Retired Commissioner Cleveland Fusenich came to my home, and he apologized to me for what he felt happened on his shift, even though we know who did what as far as the police are concerned. And they spent 15 years getting him out of their police department. It was a start. Yeah, that's how long it took to go from that time till when he retired. This was a police lieutenant with the Connecticut State Police. He later became chief of police in East Hartford, and then they had to get rid of him as well. Information about his wrongdoings are online for anyone to see.
He was the commander of the Canaan barracks of the state police.
No other recovery. I'm sorry.
No, I live on my Social Security check. That's about it. I did spend the better part of about 6 years in the commercial ambulance business. So I do know what it's like in the city, although I've never actually lived there. And I worked for professional ambulance at Hartford, and then later on paramedical ambulance at Torrington, which is now part of Campion Fitzgerald.
Just wanted to thank the panel as well, and particularly from the two Peters, allowing yourself to be vulnerable, and just to see the emotion in your voices after 50 years points out the.
Still, you know, it's 50 years, and then it's yesterday.
It's yesterday, sure. The question is, you know, you hinted at it, and that is the incredible autonomy and power that judges have. And we're grateful that there are virtuous men and women in those seats, but unfortunately, that's not always the case. And I'm particularly interested because I don't know Connecticut law well enough to be able to speak to it. But when you think about judicial review and how ill-acting judges can continue in their seats, and very often, in other states, at least I'm aware of, if you get an appeal, it's going back to the same judge. So that same judge who convicted you, who very often can look right at you in a spiteful fashion, put you away, is the very judge you'll have to see if you get the opportunity for a new trial. So is there such a thing in Connecticut as true judicial review, and who really are the watchdogs against those kinds of judges? We hope that they are few and far between, but I'd like to hear the response to that, please.
So, I mean, it's not always often, you know, a lot of people get involved in these things. So it's, you know, oftentimes it's a really bad police actor, a really bad prosecutor, or bad judge. But a lot of times, you know, a lawyer, you don't have a great lawyer. So the lawyer doesn't bring up all the stuff that's really going on. The judge is in the dark. The judge doesn't really know. And you bring up judicial review, it's really interesting. When it comes to people who are convicted of a crime, the judicial review is very deferential of what the jury decided. So judges, after a jury has decided, judges are very hesitant to overturn what the jury said. And, you know, like in Peter's case, they would say, well, the jury believed the confession, so that's what they believed. And we're not here to sit as the 10th juror and decide overturning it. Now, as you get your one appeal from your trial, let's say you lose that appeal, while Peter's appeal was going on, he filed the lawsuit against the state, or petition for a new trial. Well, the petition for a new trial, whether it's filed immediately after the conviction or years later, has an even more deferential standard of review. So now, as opposed to being innocent until proven guilty, aptly for this event, you're guilty until proven innocent, and you have to prove your innocence by clear and convincing evidence. And so, and furthermore, if you have evidence of your innocence, you have to show that it's newly discovered. And newly discovered does not include what your lawyer could have found if they had been diligent in your initial trial. And so these are things called procedural bars on the review of criminal convictions. And that's why I believe that, you know, we do need to do things like enhance conviction integrity units and give people more opportunities to appeal and outlaw these terrible tactics. But I also think that as much as we would like for those things to happen, we also need to just push for the justice system overall to be less harsh and less overbearing, because mistakes can be made and they're very, very difficult to undo. And so we have to have avenues of relief valves so people can get out of jail, or they can have it reopened a little bit more easier than it currently is. Because in Connecticut, there have only been 32 official exonerations, okay, not including the witches who were exonerated last year. And we expect that there's 3 to 5% wrongful convictions. So you're looking at closer to 5,000 to 10,000 people, only 30 exonerations.
So going back to the beginnings and to echo Alex here, the process that gets you in a situation where you are imprisoned is lengthy, but your best hope is to deter that process from even happening. Let's say you told the officer that you didn't do it, and you're already, you know, in that storm of an event. There are minutes and moments where you should make sure that you have representation. A good example now of that, something that the ACLU is working on, the team, we're working on I'm sure you've heard of it. It's a statewide scandal the false arrest scandal with state troopers and ticketing scandal and like over ticketing. So that's going to be a priority for the ACLU coming into 2024, the next legislative session. So going into that question of like, how do you keep an eye on the judges? Sure, the reviews exist, but us as citizens and residents, it's more important, how do we keep an eye on the system and making sure that the system doesn't have, it's an overreach, right? So making sure that we're changing our laws and restructuring the judicial system that works for us is a smarter way to give opportunities to avoid false arrests, to avoid folks who are falsely accused or incarcerated. 72% nationwide of inmates in federal penitentiaries are nonviolent offenders. 72%. So when you're thinking of the judicial system, oftentimes there's a branding problem that happens nationwide where people, you know, Stephen's question, the very first question of tonight's event was, why is this happening, basically? Why are we here, right? Well, we're here because the everyday person doesn't care about the quote unquote criminal, right? The word correctional facility, you're correcting behavior. They did something wrong. Penitentiary, you know, Latin penance, repent. That means they did something wrong. When in reality, a good portion of folks who are incarcerated are opiate addiction, mental health, social economic circumstances. And then, of course, there are the people who are truly bad actors. But the majority are forgotten. So if we can create a system that allows for them to not be there to begin with, not only will we save billions of dollars in our society, but we'll also create a system where we're not enforcing very harsh sentences and harsh realities in this cycle of poverty and suffering for folks who shouldn't have been there to begin with, and it really was out of their control.
Sadly, it sounds like not a lot has changed in 50 years, and I'm very sorry about that. What I'd like to speak about is most of us are familiar with Donna Palumbo. Donna was a Waterbury resident. Someone came in and raped her during the night while her children were in the next room. And the Waterbury Police Department accused her of lying. They threatened to incarcerate her. She would lose custody of her children forever. Her husband was on a business trip. 3 years later, her rapist was caught attempting to kidnap and rape a 17-year-old Brewster high school student. What this woman went through, the stigma, she was an upstanding citizen with no history, but she was just treated so badly.
Jane Doe no more.
Jane Doe no more.
Right.
This is an example of a woman who has taken something so tragic and turned it around for the benefit of all. She is assisting others within the system. What my question is, after George Floyd, we were all assured that there would be education put through the police forces that required ways to understand and prevent harm to those who they come in contact with. I would like to know, is there action being taken for liaisons within our local governments to prevent at the earliest stages the misunderstandings, the miscommunications, and the blatant lies? We understand this to be known, this protection to be known as the Great Blue Wall, and it's difficult to put through. But ultimately, are we doing anything about this culture? It has to start somewhere.
Yes. I'll take that, because I always talk about the George Floyd situation because I lived through it from the confines of my cell, right? And I watched precisely what happened all the way up to the point where Connecticut is basically leading the nation with these commutations. Mr. Taubes has gotten, I think you're over 1,000 years of getting beat. 951 years of knocked off of people's sentences. So I want to talk about George Floyd and how we got to that point. It all came about due to coronavirus. Coronavirus came around. Everybody was mandated to be in the house. People became a little agitated with being in the house. They came out a little bit. George Floyd was murdered on television. That mandate for everybody to be in was still there. So everyone saw his murder on television, right? Which is not new in and of itself to see a Black man killed on camera. The difference is you saw it repeatedly and not too many people missed it because they were home. And for the first time, citizens across the United States started to realize how government worked. And I know you remember around Corona time where people would bomb the Zooms and they come in and just say things because it was unregulated, because people did not know that you can come to the Capitol and speak your mind, right? But with that happening, everybody talking about equity in these inner cities, in these Black communities, and it was all about this appealing to the soul of human beings after seeing one murdered on television in front of the whole nation. So that's what George Floyd was. So that's when we started having all these conversations. We had these demonstrations, and there was even a show on ABC, Soul of a Nation, where they was calling out the soul of America. And it felt like things were truly going to change, all right? And I was in there and I felt this feeling, and I'm about restorative justice and doing these things. So I felt like, oh, this is really good. So everybody was bombarding the counselor's office about commutations because people didn't want to die in prison because of coronavirus. And so one day the counselor just told everybody, don't come to my office asking about a commutation no more. They're revamping it so that it can be made easier to get. Had George Floyd not passed away on television and the whole nation seeing it and everybody advocating for and enhancing the quality of African-American life, that commutation board would not have revamped that thing. And when they revamped it, you had attorneys who were already in position like Alex Taubes, who had already had a reputation for caring about people. And so it was like an alley-oop. He's right there, he takes it, and it's working, all right? But to answer your question, we're not watching the television no more. Corona, we don't care. Even though we got 20 different strands, one out right now, we don't care because we're past that. And that's the same exact thing that happened with the George Floyd thing. That's why I do want to connect with the young lady who said they have every Sunday to go there. And it's mandatory. I will be there. Hopefully Attorney Taubes, because we talked about that. But the truth of the matter is that's what happened. Everyone forgot. But so long as I am home, I will continue to fight this fight for justice on all platforms to make sure that it's not forgotten. So, yes.
To give you a little bit of a silver lining, I know that you mentioned that not much has changed in 50 years. That is true to some extent, but there's been progress. Both Peters mentioned earlier, one of the ACLU bills that did pass for interrogation, that now you can't force or coerce interrogation, but there's internally, the ability to phone a family member or a loved one for free, so that the families are not paying thousands of dollars racked up. Yeah, to call their own attorney. For those who are unaware, in most states, in Connecticut, including now, not anymore because we passed the bill, when you're incarcerated, whenever you try to communicate with your lawyer regularly or with a family member, just to say hello, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, they charge you, and then they take that money, and they basically take that money. It's thousands of dollars. So we banned that here in the state of Connecticut. Like, $5 a minute.
For $5 for a 15-minute phone call. So you get 6 a day. So it's $30 a day because you're going to use your calls. So
just to represent yourself or talk to your daughter, talk to a loved one. So that was a bill that passed. The ability for access to healthcare, real, actual decency healthcare when you're an inmate. Trans rights as an inmate also passed. So there's been changes. Overall system still broken pieces. So don't think that there hasn't been advocacy that's been successful. When you're talking about getting involved for those changes and how you could be part of that, everyone here, you're here for a reason, right? It's a weekend. It's a Saturday, 2 p.m. rainy day. You could be home. You could be cozying up to a fire. All of you already have proven to yourselves and proven to me that you're activists, you're interested, you're engaged. It's taking that enthusiasm that you're already, projecting at that rally, that event, that Sunday, and seeing how you can go just a little bit further to help your fellow man. So, we gave you suggestions. Gaylord has, a website. He has a lot going on, and he has a book. There's ways to support him. ACLU, ACLUCT.org is one way for you to funnel that energy and that desire to help. In different capacities, whatever that may look to you. It could be monetary, it could be physical, it could be writing a letter, it can be just something so simple like talking to a loved one down your street. But there's always alternatives there to get engaged.
Okay, last question.
Excuse me, not so much of a question, but I was a stringer for the Hartford Current and covered the Litchfield courts in 1976 and 1977. So I stepped in and out of Peter's case quite often. And I was interested to hear people talking about state's attorneys and prosecutors and judges. And we as reporters get to see them in a different light sometimes than you, particularly those who are being tried. But John Bianchi in particular was a very engaging person and very friendly with reporters, and we would often chat outside the courtroom, or inside the courtroom, but outside the trial. And my last conversation with him has always stuck in my mind. Shortly, just days before he died, we were sitting in a courtroom, and I was grilling him about Peter's case and where it stood and what he knew and what was changing, what was coming up. And his last words to me, which to me stick in my head, was, "I will go to my grave knowing Peter Reilly is guilty." And that was the last thing he said to me. As I never reported, I never even really talked about it. But those words have always haunted me, especially as to what transpired.
Yeah, especially what we found since then, that he was hiding evidence.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so my thing is the role of reporters in the news media, and that's another discussion for another day, but how we try to remain dispassionate and tell the truth, but prosecutors can be very effective in telling the story and turning the story and making it, turning our minds, trying to turn my mind against Peter, for instance. But that's just another story to me.
Thank you for that very appropriate final comment. So once again, I'd like to thank you for coming, and we'd like you to join us in a few minutes for some hospitality in the library. I want to note that in the library, we have on display Marc Simont's artwork from Peter's hearing. Gaylord will have a copy of his books available for signing in the reading room, and a video that he made while he was incarcerated. Also on display, Peter Reilly has provided a collection of special books from his larger library about his own case in the larger realm of wrongful conviction. On the library desk are ACLU wallet cards that help you know your rights. And there are copies of a lecture by Arthur Miller's biographer, Christopher Bigsby, upon the official release of Miller's archives at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin. They're free, just take them if you like them. And that lecture is also available in the just published fall issue of the Arthur Miller Journal. So thank you again.
Can I say one thing really
Sure.
quickly? I'm Carol Connery, my father.
Oh,
My
my
father.
gosh.
You would be so honored right now. He died about 2 years ago, and he fought every single day to the day he died for the injustice that Peter went through. And he changed his entire life the day that he heard about the case. Peter was a friend of mine, high school friend of mine, and he just changed everything. His publisher, the book he was writing, he stopped that and then just put his whole heart and soul and everything into false confessions. And it's just such an honor that, and I know that Arthur Miller would be saying the same thing right now, that this is continuing on. Yes, might be a little slower progress than he would have liked and Arthur Miller would have liked, but I just thank everybody for being here for this panel and the discussion. And I can just hear my father just yelling from heaven right now, just wanting to say something, to just try to make sure that we just don't forget everybody that's been falsely convicted. And it's such an honor to be here and to channel him right now.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you very much.
I just want to tell all of you, you're all wonderful. I'm very proud of all of you. And keep on keeping on.
I'm sure I've seen you there. I'm so sorry. I know Peter's been. I'm Brian. Brian Park. I'm sorry. I'm sure I've seen you.
Want to text me your contact card?
You're going to be faster than me. That's why I'm saying. Text yourself.
All the things that I do.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Nice to meet you. Thank you too for the work that you've done.